Babylon's Banksters, MoneyTheistic MonarchoMilitary. Babylon's Banksters, MoneyTheistic MonarchoMilitary. You're listening to Babylon's Banksters, MoneyTheistic Monarcho-Military, presented by Hakeem Alebokus Alexander on Spreaker, Social Podcasting, and Wisdom, Social Audio Inc., presented for World Reading Club in association with ExercisingYourMind.com and UniquilibriuM. This edition's reading focus comes to us from Babylon's Banksters by Joseph P. Farrell, published in 2010. Today, Chapter 5, which is titled Money, Monotheism, Monarchies, and Militaries. The Thesis of David Astle. Astle is spelled A-S-T-L-E, David Astle, you can say. I've never met the man, nor do I have heard how to pronounce his name, so I'm pronouncing it Astle or Astle. Chapter 5 of Babylon's Banksters, The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religions. Chapter 5, Money, Monotheism, Monarchies, and Militaries. The Thesis of David Astle. Quote, "They are but pudgy and sly little men, as much overwhelmed by the monster they have raised, as are the foolish nations that permitted them to do so." End quote. David Astle. They are but pudgy and sly little men, as much overwhelmed by the monster they have raised, as are the foolish nations that permitted them to do so. David Astle. A. The state of evidence and the need for speculation. David Astle is a researcher who has assembled a massive database and well-argued case for the existence in ancient times of an international bullion brokers trust allied with the temple, manipulating governments, religions, pantheons, and policies behind the scenes for its own benefit and agenda. As such, our examination here can only be a brief review of his work. It is to be emphasized that this review is but a small sampling of the types of evidence and analysis that Astle provides. This being said, Astle himself provides a strong cautionary note on the difficult state of the evidence and the need for speculation, noting that all ancient societies had a system of state warehouses connected with its money coining and regulating power. Astle states that in almost all of the works of the great archaeologists and scholars specializing in the ancient civilizations, there is a virtual silence on that all-important matter, the system of distribution of food surpluses, and surpluses of all those items needed towards the maintenance of a good and continuing life so far as were required by climate and custom. In all the writings of these great and practical scholars, the workings of that mighty engine which injects the unit of exchange among the peoples, and without which no civilization as we know it can come to be, is only indicated by profound silence of the system of exchanges, of the unit of exchange and its issue by private individuals as distinct from its issue by the authority of sovereign rule. On this all-important matter governing in such totality the conditions of progression into the future of these peoples, not a word to speak of. There is a related question, and Astle is quick to perceive it. Not only is there a paucity of evidence relating how such an international bullion brokers class might have arisen, nor evidence as to what created them. It is the pervasive and almost universal absence of such evidence that borders on the mystifying. Additionally, there is in scholarly literature on ancient international monetary policy a complete failure to speculate on those most important matters at all. But most importantly, Astle observes there is a complete absence of speculation on the true nature of the energy source by which such machinery was driven. While Astle clearly throughout his work believes that energy source to be the widespread practice of slavery in ancient times, and while we tend to agree with him insofar as that goes, there is a deeper question that Astle's comments disclose. Was there another and deeper energy source that existed in, or was being sought by, those ancient bullion brokers, fraternities besides slavery? In any case, it is this perplexing silence on such crucial matters that calls for, indeed almost compels, speculation to fill the void. Practically no information seems to exist of the growth of private money creation in the days of the ancient city-states of Mesopotamia, of which, because of their records being preserved on fire-baked clay, more is known than of more recent civilizations, and the gap must necessarily be filled by a certain amount of speculation. Little is known in the beginnings of fraudulent issuance by private persons of the unit of exchange, as in opposition to the law of the gods from whom kings in ancient times claimed to derive their divine origin. Thus, we now encounter a new dynamic. The assumption of the existence of a private international bullion broker's power has merit, then there is a conflict between its private money-creating powers and that of the various states within which it exists. There are thus two operating units of exchange, according to Astle. On the one hand, one has the circulation of coins of bullion as a unit of exchange, which coins were issued by temples and their allies, the bullion brokers, those who controlled the mines and slaves. On the other hand, one has the issuance in Mesopotamia of clay units of exchange issued by the state power itself in conjunction with the temple, which units were backed by the surpluses of the state warehouses. This is such a mirroring of the current day state. Listen to this. Once again, there are two operating units of exchange. On the one hand, one has the circulation of coins of bullion as a unit of exchange, which coins were issued by temples and their allies, the bullion brokers, those who controlled the mines and the slaves. On the other hand, one has the issuance in Mesopotamia of clay units of exchange, issued by the state power itself in conjunction with the temple, which units were backed by the surpluses of the state warehouses. It was actually backed by something, the surpluses, like food, like how are you going to feed the people, the grain, all these different things. It was backed by something. Whereas the bullion was only backed by itself, which is the question of money and getting gold and silver today, right? Can you eat that? And even in some kind of like impending doom of like a zombie apocalypse, for to use a fictional but very popular example. Can you use that gold and silver in trade? I mean, this is not John Wick, right? Where you can grab a couple gold coins and have them come and clean up a mess for you, right? But here, we're talking about what is the actual value of this, and this is the agreement here. Continuing. 1. Ancient and modern banking conspiracy. Notwithstanding all this, Astle admits, largely on the types of considerations advanced in the previous chapter here, that there are significant indicators within ancient societies of the existence of a far-reaching conspiracy in respect to monetary issuance influencing the progression of man's history in the earliest times of which written records exist. It is also outstandingly clear that it was parent to that acknowledged and most obvious conspiracy such as exists today. It is also outstandingly clear that it was parent to that acknowledged and most obvious conspiracy such as exists today. I wonder if they were talking about the same parallel that I'm thinking about continues to this day with the taking off of the gold standard. But let's see. Let's explore it further. There is, in other words, more or less a continuity between ancient times and modern ones. The question is, what is the nature of that continuity? Is it merely conceptual, rooted in the similarities of goals, methods, and beliefs of the people engaged in such activities? Or is the continuity deeper? Does it extend to actual descent of certain families and groups down through history? As will be seen in this chapter, one can answer at least the first question with a resounding affirmative. And, as will be seen momentarily, there are also significant indicators that the second question may be affirmatively answered in some cases as well. B. The medium of exchange and bullion as an order on state warehouses. Astle's argument, while profound, is not always easily seen, scattered as it is throughout his book. Care is required in noticing its steps and taking due account of them in order that its transparency may be fully exhibited. We have already noted in the previous chapter, and in this one, the following things. 1. The regulation of the value of money was established by law and regulated by the state or crown, whose sole prerogative was the issuance and regulation of such units of money. 2. There was a deep and profound relationship between the minting and issuance of such money in the form of bullion-based coins by the crown or power and the temple. 3. Prior to this period, however, in Mesopotamia, the units of exchange, as noted by Astle, were simply clay tablets of credit against the surplus in the state warehouse. It is at this last point that the story and Astle's argument really begins. The reason is easily seen, for if one were to conduct trade between states, the issuances of money in the form of letters of credit against a given state's warehouse surplus would inhibit rather than aid such trade. Another mechanism was required that would not require a diplomatic negotiation between states for each and every trade. Thus, at one and the same time as a medium of international exchange is more or less agreed upon, there also arises an international class of merchants conducting such trade and exercising sweeping influence over those units of exchange. Astle states it with his characteristic sharpness and concision. Through stealthy issue of precious metal commodity money into circulation amongst the peoples, replacing that money which represented the fiat of will of the god of the city, and which was merely an order on the state warehouses through his scribes, this internationally minded group, from the secrecy of their chambers, were able to make a mockery of the faith and belief of the simple people. In other words, at a certain juncture, and by the nature of the case, there will be two monies in circulation, one created by a private group and based on bullion commodity money issued as a facsimile for the state money for which it can be traded and substituted, and the second, the original state-issued money. It should be noted that this situation is almost exactly paralleled in modern times by the issuance of state money and private notes, both in England and the United States. In both the ancient and modern instances, the privately issued money gradually and with inexorable inevitability replaces the state issuance, and with that occurrence, the power of the private issuers of such monies is established over a society. Federal Reserve, anyone? Which is what I was talking about. That's what I was saying. I wonder if that's what it was, and there it is. But how was this substitution actually made? What was the stratagem that made it possible for ancient bullion brokers to achieve this extraordinary and sweeping influence over ancient states? The answers to these questions require an even closer look. 1. The control of mining and bullion. The issuance of bullion-based monies implies something very significant, and Assel is quick to perceive it. The whole notion of the institution of precious metals by weight as the common denominator of exchanges, internationally and nationally, cannot but have been disseminated by a conspiratorial organization fully aware of the extent of the power to which it would exceed. Could it but maintain control over bullion supplies and the mining which brought them into being in the first place. We have already seen how Egypt's Bishari mines, with their contingent of international mercenary guards, implies the existence of such an international class of merchants and bullion brokers. As an inevitable consequence of such activity, the law of the ruler previously exercised toward the well-being of the people in that might live a good and honorable life accordingly became corrupted, since that crown power was inevitably in collusion with the very class undermining its power. This fact is attested by the rise of laws punishment condemning This fact is attested by the rise of laws of punishment condemning lawbreakers to a lifetime of slavery working the semi-private mines which supplied both the state and the merchants with the medium of exchange that created their profits. Again, the situation is almost exactly paralleled in modern times, where one again encounters a private moneyed class in collusion with the state power for the expansion of their powers over the great masses of people. A further implication falls out from this, and again one perceives instantly the modern parallel. Kings largely became the mouthpiece and sword arm of those semi-secret societies that controlled the material of money, as its outward and visible symbols came to be restricted to gold, silver, and copper. The fiat of the God in heaven, which had been the decisive force behind that which brought about an equitable exchange, was replaced by the will of those classes controlling the undertones of civilizations. Leaders of the world of slave traders, caravaners, outcasts, and criminals generally, such was to be discerned on the edges of ancient city civilizations. The instrument of this will was precious metal, whose supply was controlled by the leaders of these classes through their controlled slave trade, since mining was rarely profitable in the case of the precious metals, except with slave labor. In support of this contention, Assel notes that prior to the 4th century BC, the institution of slavery had been more in the nature of a benign custom similar to the customs of the bonded servant or apprentice of the 18th and 19th centuries in Northern Europe. After that period, however, it became an extensive and international trade, complete with whips and chains and all the imagery of human suffering one associates with the institution. Thus, we now have an increasingly expanded an interesting constellation of relationships. 1. A relationship between priest-kings, the temple, money minting and issuance, and a private class of international bullion brokers. 2. A relationship of the latter class with the slave trade necessary to conduct profitable mining to circulate a bullion as a medium of exchange. 3. A relationship of the temple with money minting and issuance on behalf of that private class of bullion brokers and slave traders. And finally, 4. A relationship of the temple to astrology and all its associated accoutrements, gems, sacred geometry, earth grid locations for temples, priest magicians, forecasters, and so on. The relationship between this private class and the temples in various states exercised a correspondingly corrupting influence on their priesthoods. It is clear that with the growth of silver in circulation between private persons and between private persons and states, as now would become an inevitability, that which had been total economic control from the gods through his servants in the ziggurat was bypassed, and merchants were not able to deal privately by using their credit or powers of abstract money creation. They were also able, through their control of distant mining operations, to afflict a previously dedicated priesthood with thought of personal possession, and through the control of manufacture of weapons in distant places, they were able to arm warlike peoples towards the destruction of whosoever they might choose. Notice the dynamic subtly suggested here, for through its associations with the various temple priesthoods, such a class also influences war policies of the various states under its influence, and these, as might be expected, could often be in the guise of religious conflicts. Citing scholar T.B.L. Webster, Assel comments at length on this dynamic. The Alalaka tablets, also record copper distributed to smiths, but not in addition. It is to be used for making baskets or arrowheads, and the king of Assyria sent copper to Mari to be made into nails by the local craftsmen. A report from Pylos that the woodcutters in two places are delivering 150 axles and 150 spars for the chariot factory may be compared with the Ugartic texts on the delivery of wood for the making of arms, and a note of wood delivered to the carpenters for the construction of wagons in Alalaka. We make here also from Pylos a list of wooden objects made, a list of vessels received by men, perhaps mayors, in various places, and a note of pieces of ivory to set beside this rather slender evidence of Mycenaean manufacture. Alalaka provides a record of 64 business houses and their produce. They include smiths, leather workers, joiners, and cartwrights. Thus it seems that where the conception of money as to a silver standard existed, as at Ugarit and Alalaka, they also existed organized industry. And so also existed organized industry, including outstandingly the private manufacture of arms under methods that appear to be those of semi-mass productions. It is not without significance that this early era of privately issued money, such as was silver money, and consequent private industry, particularly that which was devoted to arms manufacture, was in certain areas so coincidental with the massive movements of warlike peoples and the collapse of ancient empires that had lived long under the pattern of life known as that of the ancient Orient. Conquering peoples needed the best of arms. It seems that the best of arms were obtainable from private industry, and private industry in its turn needed silver or gold or labor, which was slaves, in payment. both were obtainable as the result of war. Therefore, parallel, though not entirely the same as today, the more war, the more industry, and the more the need for the products of the money creators' ledgers. Hence became the more absolute the control of that which most of all designs industry and its accompanying slavery in one form or another, namely the private money creative power. Hence became the more absolute the control of that which most of all designs industry and its accompanying slavery in one form or another, namely the private money creative power. In other words, the clues have been there all along. It is just that no one has noticed them, for the great war-making empires of Mesopotamia were involved with private arms manufacture and private money issuance. This fact will loom only larger as we proceed. I mean, it's apparent to me, I don't know to anyone else, but this is, all I'm looking at is an older and ancient, it's almost like today is a facsimile of what has been going on for years, and it's the same structure, the same system that's happening to peer into. All right, but such large manufacturing and monetary concerns only lead inexorably back to the relationship between crown and temple. The renowned historian Christopher Dawson outlines the relationship with a simplicity pregnant for implications. Originally, the state and the temple corporations were the only bodies which possessed the necessary stability and resources for establishing widespread commercial relations. Temple servants were sent on distant missions, provided with letters of credit which enabled them to obtain supplies in other cities. Moreover, the temple was the bank of the community through which money could be lent at interest and advances made to the farmer on the security of his crop. Thus, in the course of the third millennium, there grew up in Mesopotamia a regular money economy based on precious metals as standards of exchange, which stimulated private wealth and enterprise and led to real capitalist development. The temple and the palace remained the centers of the economic life of the community, but by their side and under their shelter there developed a many-sided activity which found expression in the guilds of the free craftsmen and the merchants and the private enterprise of the individual capitalist. To put it simply, the fact of the existence of this class is not disputed by reputable historians, and the international extent of this trade should not be overlooked. For trade was known to extend from the city of Ur over the whole known world, which certainly reached as far afield as Europe, being carried on by means of letters of credit, bills of exchange, and promises to pay, checks made out in terms of staple necessities, of life expressed in terms of silver at valuation of barley, probably at a given season of the year. This state of affairs clearly implies an international extent to some banking and merchant class, in alliance with the temples of various states. But how would such a class arise and usurp the crown prerogative of money minting, value regulation, and issuance? 2. Ancient Babylon and Egypt. The answer to this question requires a closer scrutiny of the two major military and financial powers of that age, Egypt and Babylon. As noted so far, Babylonian money initially consisted of circulating clay tablet letters of credit drawn on the surpluses of the state warehouses, and therefore its issuance as money was strictly controlled by the crown. But as also noted immediately above, at some juncture, as early as the 3rd or 4th century BC, in fact, these existed alongside these clay tablets circulating silver of private issuance, whose value was also fixed in terms of barley or other staples in the state warehouses. In fact, so widespread was the use of the Babylonian system, which also included the use of actual checks, that one finds Babylonians at work in the temples and minting shops of some Greek cities after the Assyrian assault on Babylonia itself. In other words, assaults on Babylon only served to disperse its merchant banking class in other countries, and with that dispersal, the expansion of Babylonian business and banking practices. A. Early Egypt's independence from the Babylonian money power. It is in this context, then, that the Egyptian money power should be examined. For, as has already been noted, Egypt controlled the largest and most productive gold mines, the Bishari mines, in the ancient world. Here, too, one notes a parallel development and all its implications. According to breasted gold and copper rings of a fixed weight circulated in large-scale businesses in the time of the Old Kingdom, and significantly enough to the student of banking or private money creation and regulation, as it might better be known, stone weights were already marked with their equivalents in such rings. The circulation of money of these promises to pay, recorded on stone, pointedly suggests the likelihood of the activities of a secret fraternity whose hereditary trade was private money creation. Indeed, the parallel with Babylon is almost identical, since the latter used clay tablets as units of exchange, while Egypt used stone weights marked with their equivalent value and precious bullion. But there is likewise a significant difference as well. For in Babylon's case, those clay tablets circulated as money prior to the issuance of bullion-based monies, and the value of such monies was stated in terms of stores in the state warehouse. But with Egypt, one finds a later stage of development. For the value of the stones is expressed not in terms of the surplus stores in a warehouse, but in terms of bullion itself. In short, the concept of money has been degraded, and with it, there is almost no visible connection to the state and crown prerogative of money regulation and issuance, not to mention anything of practical value as a result of industry or creativity, i.e., goods. This is the dollar being taken off the gold standard, right? There's almost no visible connection to state and crown prerogative of money regulation and issuance, right? In short, the concept of money has been degraded from the coins, right, the gold and silver we have in storehouses, to paper. It's removed now. It's another degree separate from the original money, because there's almost no visible connection to the state and crown prerogative of money regulation and issuance, not to mention anything of practical value as the result of industry or creativity, i.e. goods, right? Because again, the value of those stones is expressed not in terms of the surplus stores in a warehouse, but in terms of bullion itself, the metals, right? And this degradation of money in Egypt, i.e. the fact that its promises to pay are expressed in valuation of bullion rather than bullion being expressed in the valuation of real goods, plus the fact of the existence of Egypt's Bishari mines with their international contingent of mercenary guards, points to a very significant and, because of its subtlety, often overlooked point. As a result, although the Egyptian empire in the earliest years might very well be described as a common market existing independent of the Babylonian money power, and deriving its strength from the will to be of a dedicated and instructed ruler, the sequence of events shows that through those concessions it obtained for its best services in war, it was not long before international money power re-penetrated the substructure of Egyptian life and established its usual behind-the-scenes influence, if not control, as in the earlier time that denoted the collapse of the Old Kingdom. it may safely be considered to have reassumed the position of hidden power it had held 1,000 years before, during the closing years of the Sixth Dynasty, a period in which the stone weights, indicating equivalence in metal money, circulated in much the same way as clay facsimiles of contemporary coinages circulated. A period in which the stone weights, indicating equivalence in metal money, circulated in much the same way clay facsimiles of contemporary coinages circulated. To put it differently, Egypt, once under the influence of that international bullion broker's power, had managed to throw off that influence only to have it restored nearly a millennium later. 3. The conspirators at work. A. Economic and military autarky and modern analogues, Sparta and the Greek tyrants. But how exactly does one know that such an international money power existed in ancient times? Assel's answer is as surprising as it is both contemporary and simple. One had only to look at certain ancient wars in conjunction with a look at the economic... You know what? I'm sorry, I have to stop here. I think that how do you know that such an international money power existed in ancient times? He says Assel's answer is as surprising as it is both contemporary and simple. Here's a contemporary and simple one. Look at your money. It says the United States of America, and also, like here in this coin, it says 1 ounce of fine silver, $1. But on the other side, what does it say? It says, "In God we trust," and has an ancient figure of liberty, like an ancient. Like, who is that? Right? What is that? Right? Some like goddess thing holding some like wheat or something like that, with a cape flowing all around and the sun coming out of the horizon behind some mountains at her feet. And her hands in some strange gesture pointing forward. Well, from what I'm looking at, to her stage right, my left. Like, what the hell? Yeah. Okay. God we trust. And then on dollar bills with ancient pyramids and eyes floating above them. What? How exactly does one know that such an international money power existed in ancient times? Because we're reproducing their symbols still to this day. That's an answer of mine that is surprising. Not to me, though, but it's contemporary and simple. But he says, one had only to look at certain ancient works in conjunction with a look at the economic activity and policies of various states to discern a hidden hand at work. There's that term, hidden hand. And the best example of this war between a money power and a state determined to maintain its independence from it, its autarky, are the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and its allies and Sparta. It is worth citing Assel and his sources at length. Of the tyrants of Greece and Asia Minor in ancient times, the learned Professor Heckelheim wrote, "These tyrants were for the most part members of the nobility themselves, who had made the grade using the new political and economic possibilities of their time to overthrow their own equals and to subdue their whole state temporarily. The tyrants were often compelled to introduce the coin economy pattern into the area over which they ruled, or at least to promote its development officially, in order to gain the upper hand over their enemies. One wonders, compelled by whom? To stabilize the position of the peasantry on the land and to expand and rebuild state economy, a central distribution of money and goods in kind partly directed toward mercenaries, bodyguards, and various political friends, and partly indirectly to the masses of poor people in the form of wages paid for extensive building operations and improvements, is characteristic of tyrant economy." Assel comments as follows. The above remarks of Professor Heckelheim indicate that there were new political and economic possibilities. In that period, 650 to 500 BC, when the tyrannies most of all flourished. And the question then becomes, what were these new political and economic possibilities? The answer is arrived at readily. They derive from the activities of the agents of the international silver bullion brokers who, from ports such as Argos, Athens, and Aegina, where King Phaedon struck the first Greek silver coinage circa 680 BC, promoted the luxury traders who sold their wares from wigs to harlots as against the new silver coinage or promise thereof. The opportunities, clearly, were for those who assisted in the monetization of the city and all its activities and possessions and its population. The result of this monetization of the city-state and of the reduction of each member of its population to the status of a mere human resource, to use the modern term, was, according to Professor Heckelheim, entirely predictable and eerily reminiscent of the free trade agreements of the late 1980s and 1990s and of their disastrous effects on the industrialized societies that adopted them. And remember, Heckelheim was writing in the 1940s, long before such agreements were in the offing, and was speaking of ancient times. The aristocracies refused equality to the landless traders and manufacturers. The peasants were oppressed by the rich and encouraged to get into debt, and then were reduced to slavery and exile. Slaves began to compete with free labor. Ambitious individuals capitalized this discontent to overthrow the constituted government and established themselves as tyrants in all the Greek cities, with the notable exception of Sparta. So what is so significant about Sparta that the rest of the Greek city-states went to war with her? Assel puts it country simple. The state that rejected international money power, as did Sparta and Rome in ancient times and Russia in modern times, had to be prepared to establish total military self-sufficiency. One might add Nazi Germany to Assel's list, for like Russia and ancient Sparta, the regime of the Third Reich had determined not only to restore the issuance of money to the state, but had embarked on a program of military and energy autarky as well. So what exactly had Sparta done that so infuriated the rest of the Greek city-states? The answer is complex and requires a brief detour. Both Plato and Aristotle were clear that money had value only insofar as it was defined by the law of the state. Plato and Aristotle were clear that money had value only insofar as it was defined by the law of the state. In other words, they both obliquely recognized that the power of issuing and regulating the value of money, was a state, not a private prerogative, and this in spite of the fact that by their time the private issuance of money was well-established practice. Thus, when one turns to the city-states of the tyrants and to their silver coin issuances, one discerns a clear, though carefully disguised, hidden hand. The evidence that the clearest coinages in Greece had essentially a local circulation in no way alters the picture previously outlined of silver money as being part of an international conspiracy. All Greek states, apart from Athens and Samos, Sifnos and Corcyra, and possibly one or two others, had to obtain silver bullion for their coinage from abroad, which necessarily obliged them to deal with those traders who specialized in dealing in bullion. Such trade in bullion had to be in the hands of a small and highly secretive group, as much on account of the sources of supply being relatively few and scattered, as it were, out to the ends of the earth, and as on account of the fact that it would be only such a group that could also control those supplies of slave labor and their purchase from triumphant peoples whose warlike activities, as likely not, they had instigated themselves, slave labor so necessary to the success of their mining operations. Once the course had been determined in various Greek city-states to issue bullion-based money, which bullion they had in scarce supply, those city-states came increasingly under the influence and sway of the bullion brokers themselves, all except one, which refused to issue bullion-based coinage: Sparta. Hence, one now has a basis of understanding for Sparta's well-known harshness and the military discipline it imposed on her whole population. For if she were to maintain her independence of the money power infecting the other Greek city-states, her military had to be the best. Thus, there is a hidden and much more real purpose to the infamous Peloponnesian War, a war that neither Athens nor Sparta had won and neither one had lost. The war left both powerful Greek city-states exhausted, and over their prostrate bodies the servants of this same sardonic money power drew the chains of their slavery. That real underlying purpose of the Peloponnesian War was to establish private common money market across the Greek world, totally controlled by the trapezitae, or bankers in modern terminology. Consequently, judging by Sparta and later by Rome itself, it seems that in ancient times there was some considerable understanding of the power inherent in precious metal money to destroy, by lending itself to manipulation, the status quo of any race or state. It seems that in ancient times there was some considerable understanding of the power inherent in precious metal money to destroy, by lending itself to manipulation, the status quo of any race or state. B. Babylon, Persia, and money creation. Yet another and even more persuasive example of the actions and hidden directions of a money power on the international scene is afforded by the case of Babylon and Persia. It is worth citing Assel again at length. It is not until the Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian eras that clear evidence can be traced of the total degradation of kingly power and of kings and so-called emperors, as quite often being little more than gloriously be-meddled frontmen for private money-creative power striving to create worldwide hegemony. They still continued to be needed principally as a point towards which the eyes of the people might be diverted, in order that the people might not realize that all was not well in that direction towards which their loyalties naturally leaned, nor glimpse of the destructive forces that were gnawing at the roots of the tree of life itself. Even as far back as 2500 BC, Sargon of Akkad proceeded into Anatolia to chastise the city of Ganes Ganes on account of the commercial community of Mesopotamia, probably to enforce the payment of interest on loans or repayment of principal, one of the reasons of the success of Cyrus, though but a petty Persian prince formerly to 550 BC, when he deposed his sovereign, Astyages the Mede, is clear from the circumstances of his victory over Croesus of Lydia in 546 BC. Croesus had offended the international money powers by seizure of their treasure held by their agent Sadietes, and by the total assumption of monetary issue by the state. Example had to be made of him to deter other princes from similar action. JFK, and the eager and ambitious Cyrus was obviously the one chosen for this purpose. According to the articles on Babylonia in the Encyclopedia Britannica 9th edition by Professor Sayce, Croesus had rashly joined battle with Cyrus without waiting for the arrival of his Babylonian allies under Nabu-Nahwa, the father of Belshazzar of the Book of Daniel. It is more than likely, however, that a truer reading of these events would be that international money power, patron of the rise of Cyrus, both through organization of his supplies of mercenary soldiers and of the best weapons, had been the principal influence in these events as in other enterprises of Cyrus, such as the siege of Babylon 14 years later. Thanks to his influence, while the progress of Nabu-Nahwa towards junction with the forces of Croesus would not have been sabotaged, Croesus himself would have been misinformed of the intentions and strength of both Cyrus and Nabu-Nahwa. Cyrus won the day, and Croesus was totally humbled, having thus proven his suitability and his readiness to promote the policies of his financial backers. The relatively easy conquest of Babylon was arranged for Cyrus some 14 years later. Who arranged for the easy conquest of Babylon? More importantly, who financed the vast Persian war machine? The answer, according to Assel, is a biblical one. It is interesting to note, he observes, that shortly after the entry of the Persian forces into the city, the children of Israel were permitted to return to that which they considered their homeland, and every assistance was given them towards renewal of their national life and the rebuilding of their temple, which, of course, was its heart. The special concessions made by Cyrus to the Hebrew almost on entry into the city of Babylon would certainly suggest that he had received their substantial assistance, perhaps through financial rewards, the purchase of the finest of military accoutrements, such as would be obtained only through the good graces of the Babylonian commercial and banking houses, or through that information which the Hebrew may have kept him constantly supplied, such as the state of military preparedness within the city, etc. It may reasonably be assumed that the Babylonian money power was completely international in outlook, whatever its outward profession, and totally unsympathetic toward the ancient faith of the ziggurat and the worship of Marduk, and towards the intended effects of the restoration of the ziggurat at Ur at that time by Nebuchadnezzar. If in earlier Assyrian times such money power certainly was not the Hebrew, though possibly linked thereto through members of the latter Israelitish confederacy, the fact of the existence of powerful Hebrew influence in international finance in Neo-Babylonian times seems a reasonable supposition. The Hebrew may have risen to a specially privileged position in the Babylonian money industry, if that is what it can be called, and may have come to learn at that time those secret practices of the money changer's craft, which he was certainly forbidden in his native land, according to the laws of Moses. Indeed, as Assel points out, the Hebrews returning to Palestine were compelled, under Ezra's edict, to divorce their foreign wives. While certainly explainable as a religious ordinance designed to restore doctrinal and racial purity, Assel notes that the practice of intermarriage is itself the hallmark of the international banking class to this day, and thus Ezra's ordinance may itself be an indicator that the Hebrews had indeed penetrated the international money power during the Babylonian captivity. There is yet another indicator of this Babylonization of Hebrew religion and practice, and that is the existence of the Talmud and the rabbinate itself, and the adopted symbol of the Hebrews and Jewish people to this day, the so-called Mogen David, or Star of David. This symbol is itself of Babylonian, not Hebrew origin, and as we shall see in the next chapter, it is an apt symbol of a fraternity that is keeping secrets. I want to make a note about that too, though, is that since they're all interconnected, as has been pointed out earlier, there's another way the Star of David could have been contrived. The Nile River. If you're looking across the Nile River towards the Great Pyramid of Giza, At a certain point, where you're standing, you can see, of course, the Great Pyramid of Giza in front of you, pointing up towards the sky, and the reflection of it in the Nile River will be pointing down. And you cross those over each other, and you get that star. And this is also indicators of as above, so below, of the sun god Ra and other deities and so on and so forth, which I could go on forever about, but in order to finish this up, I shall not. Instead, I'll continue to see how the conspiracy worked. It is perhaps in the actual history of the development of the private issuance of bullion-based monies in ancient times and in various civilizations that one most clearly discerns the evident hand of a hidden international class of bullion brokers, war merchants, slave traders, and mining operators, for almost invariably the pattern is the same. 1. The first stage. Penetrate and ally with the temple. Penetrate and ally with the temple. As noted repeatedly throughout the previous pages, from Greece to Rome, to Egypt and the Mesopotamian civilizations of Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria, there is a clear association of banking activities and of minting itself with the temple. The reason for this association, at least as far as banking and finance go, are easy to rationalize. These persons had conducted their business in the shade of the temple courtyards from ancient days as, and if they could, in order that the power or mystery as locally was held in awe might give sanctity to their activities, which so often were exercised against the well-being of the people who sheltered them. These agents would have lurked as only faintly discernible shadows behind the temple facade, although they instigated much of what came to pass in those days, if themselves so little seen. Of first concern to them would have been the reputation of their masters, the priesthood, for piety, probity, and godliness, insofar as appearance went. For by maintaining the position of the priesthood, they maintained themselves and their secret power, yet for whatever they brought about, especially if of evil, it may safely be assumed a nevertheless in the priesthood would be held responsible. With the sanctity of the temple as a shelter and cloak of their activities, this bullion brokers class could then engage in the next stage of their activity. 2. The second stage. Issue false receipts. God damn, this is... I mean, it makes too much sense. It makes too much sense that they would use the temple because people would see it as being like a sanctity, that they would see it as being a sanctuary. They would see it as like this highfalutin, like high level stuff going on that's happening there, rather than some hidden thing going on that's against the people, that's working against the people. They would be like, oh, they're just praying. This is the Holy of the Holies. You know, it's God's temple, God's house. Let's not bother what they're doing. Let's not bother to look at what's happening. They're doing good for us. They're the intermediaries between God. Jesus in the temple overthrowing the table, anyone? Money? Business? What was he talking about? What was he mad about? Let's continue. That second stage is to issue counterfeit or false receipts against the credit or surpluses of the state warehouse, and thereby to increase the money supply itself. Word. The principal device at this stage may be assumed to be the secret and private expansion of the total money supply, effected primarily by the issuance into circulation of false receipts for valuables supposedly being held on deposit in thief-proof vaults, or otherwise for safe custody. Such issuance would be relatively easy to come by, for by penetration of and close association with the temples of various states, they would have had access to the seals and other devices used to authenticate letters of credit by the temple priesthoods. The third stage. Substitute bullion for letters of credit as a measure against false receipts. Man, this is... I mean, except for the fact that they're painting it in such a sinister light right here, this is the same exact thing of paper money in the United States and in other places. This is the exact thing. Substitute bullion for letters of credit as a measure against false receipts. False receipts being saying that there's more in the vaults there, because if you issue more money saying each one of these is worth something in that vault that's held for safekeeping under lock and key, right? You're saying that at any time you can bring this to us and cash it in and get your grain, get your cows, get your whatever that really is in there of value, right? Goods. But no. This brings us inevitably to the third stage. For once a sufficient number of such false receipts were in circulation, it would become apparent both to the crown and to members of the temple itself that there were simply too many false receipts in circulation, and that a monetary reform was necessary. At this juncture, in step the bullion brokers with the solution, holding a virtual monopoly on mining. They proposed the substitution of bullion-based coinage, whose value is initially defined by a certain amount of actual goods, barley, as we saw in the case of Mesopotamia, for the actual state-issued letters of credit. Once any crown and temple alliance with any state given, once any crown and temple alliance within any given state accepts this arrangement, it will become increasingly hostage to the need for bullion and for the merchants, slave traders, and mining mercenaries that can supply it, and that have the technology to mine and melt and mint it. 4. The fourth stage. Then create a facsimile of money. Having artificially stimulated and increased the value of bullion, this class then creates the final step. It issues new letters of credit against the supply of bullion rather than against the warehouse surplus, and defines those letters of credit as valuation in terms of weight of some precious bullion. And I'm saying, quote, right, in terms of some weight of precious bullion. Thus, we arrive back at the state of issuing false receipts. Only in this instance, the receipts are neither false nor counterfeit. They are simply privately created notes or promises to pay a certain amount of bullion, which they also control. Thus, once again, the money supply is not only expanded, but the use of such instruments actually served to allow the bullion brokers to create more of such notes than they had actual bullion to redeem. The key, once again, was the sanctifying probity that the Temple Association gave them. Remember that I saw this word probity in in Wealth of Nations earlier when I read it, and I want to revisit that definition again because it was a word, right, that means the quality of having strong moral principles, honesty and decency, right? So they're hiding behind that image of strong moral principles of honesty and decency that the Temple Association gave them, right? So with this step, their power and influence over the various states which they penetrated was almost complete, for it gave these ancient bankers, like their modern counterparts, the ability to expand or contract a state's With this step, their power and influence over the various states which they penetrated was almost complete, for it gave these ancient bankers, like their modern counterparts, the ability to expand or contract a state's money supply and to control their economies to create boom or bust. The final step, in other words, was to create a clay or stone, or in modern times, paper or plastic, facsimile of the facsimile of state-issued money, the bullion-based monies, also of their own creation. B. The parallel to the aftermaths of the Cosmic War and World War II, the globalist agenda and money, monarchies, monotheism, and militaries, in which this Babylon's Banksters reading gets its name from. For brevity, I named it MoneyTheistic, MonarchoMilitary. It comes from the title of this chapter 4, part 4, Money, Monarchies, Monotheism, and Militaries. But there is a final piece to this ancient story and plot, and it is one of the most breathtaking of them all. The effect of the alliance of this bullion brokers class with the temple throughout the ancient world would have brought to their attention the fact that the pantheons of various civilizations and even the stories and acts associated with various gods were all remarkably similar. As a result of this realization, the bullion brokers would also come to realize that they could actually create that which functioned as money with but the record incised by the stylus on the clay tablet promising metal or money. Obviously, as a result of this discovery, which depended on the confidence they were able to create in the minds of people of their integrity, provided they banded themselves together with an absolute secrecy that excluded all other than their proven brethren, they could replace the God of the city himself as the giver of all. If so be they could institute a conception of a one God, their God, a special God of the world, a God above all gods, then not merely the city, be it Ur or Kish, or Lagash or Uruk, but the world itself could be theirs, and all that in it was. In other words, behind the creation of the vast empires of Persia, and later the Macedonian Greek Empire of Alexander the Great, there lies the activity of a powerful financial interest, striving to create an ancient new world order with a central state and a unified religio-cultural world. And the mechanism by which to foster this religious worldview would be to gradually point out and inculcate the idea in popular imagination that all local religions were but the same thing, various names for the same gods. Thus, the whole weight of their combine and cabal would have been thrown behind the promotion of a monarchical front, representative of the new empire and the new monotheism, and backed by the latest military hardware. But there is another possibility, one suggested by the scenario of a cosmic war outlined in the first chapter, and that is, if the survivors of a once scientifically sophisticated civilization were ever to reach the pinnacle of scientific power and achievement that would have made an interplanetary war possible, if, that is, they were ever to reconstruct the destructive technologies of their hegemony and extend themselves again into space, then they would have quite literally to draw on the full resources of the entire world and to create the wars and conflicts that drove technological achievement forward at a faster than normal pace of the development. In this case, they would develop not only secret associations for this purpose, but money and a close association with the temples would be the easiest and least technologically sophisticated method to do it. And the political goal would be the same, ever larger empires, eventually to encompass the entire globe itself. This association of money creation with the temples and with the goal to create a unified world order for the purpose of reconstructing a lost technology of hegemony, is where the story gets really interesting. As they say, the plot is about to thicken. Coming up next, but not now, is part 6. Titled, Alchemy Upsets the Apple Cart. The Transmutative Medium and the Alchemy of the Stars and Banksters. And it starts with a quote. Further support for the hypothesis that a transnational interrelationship existed between ancient mystery schools was the discovery of the Gunderstrup Cauldron, a superb example of the silversmith's art. This bowl, which was discovered in a Jutland peat bog, is decorated with pan-cultural deities. Brian Desborough. That's coming up next in part 6 of Babylon's Banksters. For now, you have just listened to, and you've been listening to, Babylon's Banksters, MoneyTheistic MonarchoMilitary, presented by Hakeem Alibokis Alexander, here on Spreaker, Social Podcasting, and Wisdom, Social Audio Inc. Presented for World Reading Club in association with ExercisingYourMind.com and UniquilibriuM.